There are cases in Watson's casebook that were never meant for the reading public. Not because they were shameful, or because the law demanded silence, but because the people at the center of them were still very much alive, still walking through drawing rooms and dining on quiet streets. And the particular truth Holmes had uncovered was the kind that, once spoken aloud, could not be gathered back. This was one of those cases. Watson had made a promise. A small promise, offered almost without thinking, the way one sometimes does when a woman looks at you with tired eyes and says, simply, please. He had kept it for many years. He kept it still, mostly. But there are evenings when the fire burns low and the rain makes its familiar conversation against the window glass, when he finds himself opening the older pages of his notes, the ones written in a slightly smaller hand because he had been conserving ink, and he reads through them with the particular tenderness one reserves for things that were never quite resolved, only gently set aside. The detail that returned to him most often was the scent. Lavender. Yes, but not the lavender of soap or sachets, or the dried bunches sold at market corners. Something finer, something with a quality of distance in it, as though it had travelled a long way before arriving in that room. He could never quite explain it further than that. Holmes had explained it very precisely, of course, had explained it in the way Holmes explained most things, with a thoroughness that answered every question, and somehow left Watson sitting quietly with an entirely new one. But the scent itself, the first impression of it, in 221B on that particular November evening, that was Watson's alone, and it stayed with him, now. Let us go back. November. The kind of November that London produces with what feels like personal intention, grey from the first light, heavy with moisture that never quite decides to become rain, the fog arriving by mid-afternoon as though it had an appointment to keep. The streets of Baker Street were slicked with it, the gaslight on the corner doing its modest best to push back the dark and managing only to illuminate a small, blurred circle of amber that trembled every time a carriage passed. Inside 221B, the sitting room was warm. Generously warm, actually. Holmes had built the fire up to a height that Mrs. Hudson had twice regarded with a calculating look, and once remarked upon aloud, though only once, because she was a practical woman who understood the difference between battles worth fighting and battles worth acknowledging before retreating to the kitchen. The coals were doing their work. The brass fender caught their glow and scattered it in warm fragments across the hearthrug, across the papers stacked on the mantel, across the arm of Watson's chair, where Watson sat with a medical journal that he had been reading for approximately 40 minutes without absorbing a single sentence. This was not unusual. There were evenings in Baker Street that had a quality of suspension to them, evenings where nothing was happening, and nothing was expected to happen, and yet some atmospheric quality of the rooms made it difficult to commit to anything as definitive as reading. Holmes was the source of this atmosphere more often than not. He was across the room, standing at the window, not looking out of it, so much as standing adjacent to it, his hands behind his back, his dressing gown a deep burgundy that had seen better days, his profile turned just slightly toward the glass. He had been standing there, in some variation of that position, for the better part of an hour. He had not spoken, he had not moved to any of his instruments, or his papers, or his chemical apparatus, or any of the other objects that absorbed his attention in cycles. He was simply present, and alert, in the way that certain animals are alert, not tense, but awake in some fundamental sense that communicated itself to the room around him. Watson turned a page of his journal. The fire shifted and settled with a small, comfortable sound. Somewhere below there was the faint percussion of Mrs. Hudson moving through the kitchen with quiet efficiency. And outside, at a distance, the bells of a church, whose name Watson had never been curious enough to confirm, rang the hour in slow, bronze strokes that dissolved gently into the fog before they reached their final count. 7 o'clock. "You are not reading?" Holmes said, without turning from the window. "I am reading," Watson said. "You turned that page 12 minutes ago. The same page." Watson considered this. "I am reading slowly," he amended. Holmes made a sound that was not quite a laugh, more the ghost of one, arriving before the feeling had fully committed to expression. He turned slightly, his gaze dropping to the street below, and Watson saw something shift in the set of his shoulders. A very small thing, the way attention reorganizes itself when it finds an object worth reorganizing around. "There is a woman," Holmes said, "standing on the opposite pavement. She has been standing there for approximately 4 minutes. She is dressed in black with a veil. Lavender, I think, though the light makes the colour difficult to confirm at this distance. She's looking at the door." Watson set his journal down properly this time and rose to stand beside Holmes at the window. Below, in the amber-edged dark, he could make out the figure, still and upright against the fog, a dark coat, and yes, something about the veil that caught the gaslight differently from the rest of her clothing, a softness in the colour that was neither grey nor purple, but somewhere between the two. She held a small bag in both gloved hands. She did not move. "She has been deciding," Holmes said quietly, "whether to knock, whether to proceed. She knocked at a door 2 streets over, I imagine. A doctor's door or a solicitor's. Found it wanting, or found herself wanting, in the resolve to enter. She has come here instead." He paused. "Or she has come here first, and has been gathering herself since she arrived." He tilted his head slightly. "The second, I think. Look at the bag." Watson looked. The bag was held in both hands. Held, not carried. Held the way one holds something when one needs the occupation of holding it. "She has been standing long enough to grow cold," Holmes observed, "but she has not moved toward the door. That is not indecision about whether to come. That is indecision about whether to speak." He said nothing further. He returned to the centre of the room, took up his pipe from the mantel, did not light it, and settled into his chair with the ease of a man who had decided that events would arrive at their own pace, and that patience was the only reasonable response. Watson remained at the window for a moment longer. The woman below had not moved. The fog moved for her, drifting in slow, pale eddies around the circle of gaslight, and she stood in it with a stillness that Watson found, even then, before he knew anything about her, quietly affecting. He returned to his chair. 3 minutes passed, perhaps 4. Then, from below, the knock. Measured, not loud, but deliberate. A knock that had been rehearsed in some small private way. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps crossed the hall. A pause. The towit, low exchange of voices, too muffled to pass. Then the creak of the stairs, slow and steady, and Mrs. Hudson's head appearing at the sitting-room door with the particular expression she wore when she was conveying information and reserving full commentary for a later occasion. "A lady to see you, Mr. Holmes, a Madame Renar. She says she has no appointment, and she apologizes for the hour, and she—" Mrs. Hudson paused, in the way of someone choosing words. She asked if you might see her nonetheless. "Show her up, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes said, with the ease of a man who had already decided this some minutes ago. Mrs. Hudson nodded, withdrew, and her footsteps descended again. In the brief interval before the visitor arrived, Watson noticed that Holmes had straightened very slightly in his chair. Not with anticipation exactly, but with a quality of increased receptiveness, like a lens being brought into focus. His eyes went to the door. His pipe remained unlit in his fingers. The sitting room was warm. The fire had settled to a steadier, more dignified burn. The rain that the evening had been threatening had finally made up its mind, and was applying itself to the window in a quiet, rhythmic way that made the room feel, if anything, more enclosed and more sheltered than before. The smell of coal smoke and old paper, familiar as the rooms themselves, filled the air. And then, as the footsteps reached the top of the stairs and the door opened, something else moved through it, something quieter than a scent and more present than a memory. Floral, precise, soft at the edges, but with a clarity underneath, like a note held in a piece of music after the rest of the instruments have resolved. Watson noticed it. He glanced at Holmes. Holmes had noticed it too. She entered the room. She was, Watson thought, somewhere in her middle 30s, though the veil, which she had not yet removed, made certainty difficult. She was tall, and held herself with the kind of upright composure that had clearly been her natural bearing long before the evening's difficulty had required it. Her coat was good wool, dark, well made. Her gloves were kid leather, pale grey, and they were twisted slightly at the fingers from where she had been holding them together. Her veil was the colour Watson had half guessed from the window, a genuine lavender, light and fine, the kind of thing that was not a matter of mourning, but of something more personal, a preference, or a meaning. She looked around the room with the specific thoroughness of someone cataloguing an environment before committing to it. The fire, the papers, the chemical corner, Watson, Holmes. And then she settled her gaze on Holmes and said, in a voice that was careful and accented faintly, in a way that suggested long years of Paris before London, "Mr. Holmes, I am grateful you will see me. I am aware that I am imposing on your evening without notice, and I am sorry for it." "Sit down." "Madame Renar," Holmes said, gesturing to the chair nearest the fire. "You have been standing in the cold for some time. Mrs. Hudson will bring tea directly, I expect." She sat. She did not remove the veil immediately. She placed her bag on her lap and held it, same posture as the pavement, and Watson, settling back into his own chair with the quiet ease of a man accustomed to sitting through the beginning of things, watched her with the particular attentiveness that years beside Holmes had taught him, not to perform observation, but to simply be present to it. "I have a strange story to tell," she said. "Most stories brought to this room are strange," Holmes replied. "Begin where it is most natural to begin, not where you think the story should begin. They are rarely the same place." She was quiet for a moment. The fire spoke quietly. The rain continued its patient business at the window. Then she reached up and lifted the veil back from her face, folding it over the brim of her hat with a gesture that was both practised and, Watson thought, deliberate, as though it was an act of decision, not just of comfort. She had dark eyes, clear, tired, and, he noticed this before anything else, very watchful. "It began in Paris," she said, "or I thought it began in Paris. Now, I am not sure when it began at all." Holmes settled back slightly. The faint shift of attention Watson had seen in his posture earlier had not diminished. If anything, it had deepened, quieted, the way a river runs faster when it narrows. "Tell me about Paris," Holmes said. And so she did. And Watson, his unread journal long forgotten on the table beside him, listened, while the fire burned and the fog pressed gently at the window, and the tea, when it arrived, went largely cold in the cups. The tea had gone cold by the time Madame Renar finished speaking. This was not unusual in 221B. Tea had a habit of going cold there, not from neglect exactly, but from the particular quality of attention that the rooms demanded when something interesting was being said. Mrs. Hudson had long since made her peace with it. She retrieved cups with the philosophical acceptance of a woman who understood that some households ran on warmth and some ran on curiosity, and that hers, for better or worse, ran primarily on the latter. Watson had not moved from his chair. He was aware of this only because his left knee had begun to remind him of it, in the mild, insistent way it sometimes did on damp evenings, a legacy of warmer climates and less comfortable circumstances, arriving now with the regularity of an old correspondent. He shifted slightly, and said nothing, and kept his eyes on the woman across the hearth. Madame Celeste Renar had told her story the way certain people tell stories that have been told before, with a smoothness that was not quite natural, a narrative that moved from point to point, with a confidence that suggested rehearsal without quite proving it. Watson had noticed this. He suspected Holmes had noticed it considerably earlier, and with considerably more precision, but Holmes had not interrupted, had not redirected, had not done any of the things he sometimes did when a witness was shaping their account more carefully than the truth required. He had listened, which meant, Watson knew, that he was storing. "Let me tell you from the beginning," she had said, and had done so, and the beginning, as she gave it, was this. She had lived in Paris for 11 years. She had gone there first, as a young woman accompanying an aunt, whose health required a warmer climate, and whose temperament required a more forgiving society than London offered. The aunt had recovered and returned. Celeste had not. She had found, in Paris, the particular quality of life that suited her. Not glamorous, she was careful to say, but spacious. There was room in Paris, she said, for a woman to occupy her own life without constant commentary from others on how the occupation was proceeding. She had worked. She had translated French to English and back again, for publishers, for legal houses, for a small and rather distinguished theatre company that produced English plays for French audiences and French plays for English ones. She had lived in the same set of rooms on the Rue Saint-Dominique for 7 years. She had been, by her own account, content. Quietly, ordinarily, sustainably content, which is a different and more durable thing than happiness, and which Watson, listening, recognized with the private recognition of someone who understood the distinction from the inside. The disturbances had begun 8 months ago. The first was small enough that she had dismissed it. She returned from an evening engagement to find 3 sprigs of dried lavender arranged on her window-sill. The window had been latched. Her concierge, when asked, had seen no one. She had assumed a neighbour. There were eccentricities enough in her building, to make this plausible, and thought no more of it. The second came a fortnight later. She woke in the morning to find, on her dressing mirror, writing in the condensation of her own breath and the night's cold air, or so it appeared. The words were in French. Je te vois encore. I see you still. By the time she had gathered herself enough to examine it properly, it had begun to fade, the room warming, the glass clearing, and she was left with only the memory of the letters and a feeling she could not entirely name. Not fear, she said. Not quite. Something older than fear, and quieter. The feeling, she said, of being regarded. Holmes had said, at that point, simply, "Continue." She had gone to her concierge again. She had spoken to her neighbours, carefully and without causing alarm. She had checked her locks. She had found nothing. She had slept poorly for several weeks, and then, as often happens with disturbances that do not escalate and do not explain themselves, she had begun to adjust. The human capacity for adjustment, Watson had often thought, was either the most admirable or the most troubling of our qualities, depending very much on what was being adjusted to. Then, in September, she had come to London. The move was professional. A publisher on the Strand had offered her a longer contract, a series of French novels, recently fashionable, requiring English translation with particular care for tone and period. It was good work, well paid, and she had reasons beyond the professional to welcome a change of city. She had sublet her Paris rooms, taken lodgings in Bloomsbury, and settled into London with the efficiency of a woman accustomed to managing her own arrangements. The lavender had followed her. Watson had leaned forward slightly at this point, without quite deciding to. The image had something in it, something that bypassed the analytical and arrived directly at the instinctive. A woman crossing a sea, and finding that what had haunted her rooms had simply crossed with her, had arrived perhaps before she did, had been waiting. The first London incident had occurred within a week of her arrival. Lavender petals, not dried sprigs this time, but fresh petals, very slightly wilted, scattered across the threshold of her room at the Bloomsbury lodging house. Her door had been locked. Her landlady, a Mrs. Peel, had seen nothing, and nobody. The other lodgers, when discreetly inquired of, had neither seen nor smelled anything unusual, which Celeste found interesting in itself, because the scent, she said, had been considerable, strong enough that she had stood at the doorway for a moment, simply breathing it, before the strangeness of the situation had reasserted itself. Then, 3 weeks ago, the mirror, her dressing room again, the morning again, the condensation on the glass, and within it, this time in English, careful, unhurried English, the letters formed with something she could only describe as patience. You brought me with you. She had sat down on the edge of her bed and had not moved for some time. How long? Holmes asked. She considered. Perhaps half an hour, she said. Perhaps more. I am not certain. I was thinking. What were you thinking? The question was not unkind, but it was direct in the way Holmes's questions sometimes were. Direct in a way that slipped past the social machinery that usually softened such inquiries and arrived at the actual territory. She looked at him for a moment before answering. I was thinking, she said, that I did not feel the way I should feel. I should have been frightened. I was frightened, I think, underneath. But the first feeling was something else. It was... She stopped, looked at her gloved hands. It was like being recognized, which is a terrible thing to say, given the circumstances. But you asked what I was thinking, and that is honestly what I was thinking. Holmes was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted behind the grate. Watson said nothing, which was the correct thing to say. "Yes," Holmes said eventually, and his voice had something in it, not warmth exactly, but a quality of acknowledgement that was its own form of care. "That is an honest answer. Thank you for it." She had gone to the police after the second London incident. She told this part of the story with a brevity that communicated everything. The desk sergeants carefully maintained neutrality. The inspector, who had been kind in the way that people are kind when they are deciding something is not a real matter. The suggestion that she was perhaps overtaxed with work. The entirely useless assurance that if anything concrete occurred, she should not hesitate to return. She had not returned. She had, instead, asked someone she trusted. She did not name this person, and Holmes did not press her on it, who she should see. The answer had been Baker Street. She had taken the answer home with her, and had spent 2 days deciding whether to act on it, and then a third day standing on the pavement outside 221B in the November fog, which they had all already established. "I am not a fanciful woman," she said, and there was something almost apologetic in the way she said it, as though she expected not to be believed, and was getting ahead of the disbelief. "I do not believe in ghosts. I have not, at any point, genuinely believed that what was happening to me was supernatural in origin. But I have been unable to determine a natural explanation, and that—" She paused. "That is, I confess, almost worse. A ghost is at least a complete answer." Holmes had been still throughout her account, in the way he was still when he was receiving information rather than processing it. The processing would come later, in the silence and the smoke, and the particular quality of withdrawn attention he adopted when the rooms were at their quietest. But now he leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and looked at her with a directness that was not aggressive, but was entirely undecorated. "You said Paris and London," he said. "What about the time between, the journey itself, the crossing, the days of travel? Did anything occur in transit?" She blinked. It was a small blink, the kind that means a question has landed somewhere unexpected. "No," she said slowly. "No, nothing. I travelled in company. A colleague from the publisher's Paris office was making the same crossing. Nothing occurred." "And the Paris incidents, how many in total?" "3 that I counted as incidents. Several smaller things that may have been nothing." "Tell me the smaller things." She did. A displaced object, a book she was certain she had left on the right side of her desk, found on the left. A window she had closed, found open on 2 occasions, though both times there had been wind, and she had admitted the wind as a possible explanation. A scent in the stairwell of her building on 3 separate evenings. That same, precise lavender that had not been there when she descended again minutes later. Holmes listened to all of it with equal attention, which Watson recognized as significant. Holmes distributed his attention according to relevance, not social courtesy. If he was listening to the small things with the same quality of focus as the large ones, it was because he had already found something in them. "The lavender," Holmes said. "Describe it as precisely as you can. Not the incidents, the scent itself. Close your eyes if it helps." She looked at him steadily for a moment. This was not, her expression suggested, A woman who closed her eyes on instruction without deciding first that it was a reasonable instruction. And then she did. And she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "It is not the lavender you smell in sachets, not the soap lavender. It is cleaner than that, more precise. And underneath it, there is something that is not quite floral, something that is almost sharp, but not unpleasantly, like the lavender has been distilled, and then something has been added back that is very small and very careful, and it lingers. Not the way cheap scent lingers, not cloying. It lingers the way a piece of music lingers. You're not sure when it's stopped." She opened her eyes. Holmes was looking at her with an expression that Watson, in all his years of watching Holmes receive information, had come to privately classify as the expression of a man who has just been given something he was not expecting and is finding it considerably more interesting than what he had expected. It was a particular quality of stillness, a stillness that had energy in it, rather than absence. "Thank you," Holmes said. "That is very precise." "You recognize it?" Watson asked. "I recognize the category," Holmes said, and said nothing further, which meant he recognized considerably more than that, and was not yet ready to lay it out for examination. He stood. Then, the sudden unfolding of thought into movement that Watson recognized as the beginning of the phase where Holmes stopped receiving and started working, and moved to the window. Outside, the fog had thickened since Madame Renard's arrival, the gaslight below now barely a suggestion of warmth in the grey. He stood with his back to them, looking out, and when he spoke again, his voice had the quality of a man thinking half aloud, arranging rather than addressing. "You are not in danger," he said. "I want you to be clear on that point. What is happening to you is deliberate and intelligent, and, I suspect, has a logic to it that we will find when we look in the right direction. It is not random. It is not supernatural. And it is not, I think, malicious, though it has been careless of your peace, which is its own form of unkindness." He turned. "I will need you to tell me everything again. Tomorrow, if you are willing. Not because I did not hear you tonight. I heard every word. But because a second telling almost always differs from the first in ways that are not deliberate, and those differences are often the most honest part of any account." She stood. She smoothed her coat with both hands, a composed, gathering gesture, and then she replaced her veil, not hurriedly, with the same deliberateness with which she had removed it. "I will come at whatever hour suits you," she said. 10 o'clock, Holmes said. "The light is better, and Mrs. Hudson's patience with early visitors has its limits." Something moved across her face at this, not quite a smile, but the near neighborhood of one. "Then 10 o'clock, she said. She looked at Watson briefly. "Thank you, Doctor, for your company." It was no imposition, Watson said, which was true in ways he would have found difficult to fully articulate. Mrs. Hudson was summoned, the coats retrieved, and Madame Renar descended the stairs with the same quiet composure she had brought up them. The front door opened, and closed below. Watson crossed to the window and watched her emerge onto the pavement, pause for just a moment, the same pause she had made on arriving, but different now, lighter, and move away into the fog, her figure dissolving by degrees until the lavender veil was the last thing visible, and then was not visible at all. "Well," Watson said. Said Holmes. "She is telling the truth." "She is telling a truth," Holmes said, from behind him, which is not the same thing, and is considerably more interesting. He had retrieved his pipe, and was now applying himself to the business of lighting it, with the focused attention he gave to small, precise tasks. "Come and sit down, Watson. I want to think about lavender." The fire had burned lower, while they had been otherwise occupied, and Watson added a coal with the quiet efficiency of long habit, and settled back into his chair and listened to the rain and the soft sounds of the house settling around them. He would think about lavender for a long time after that. Holmes did not sleep that night. This was not unusual. Holmes's relationship with sleep was, at the best of times, an arrangement of mutual convenience, rather than genuine compatibility. He slept when the case permitted it, and when it did not, he did not sleep, and the night hours became instead a long, quiet conversation between himself and whatever problem had taken up residence in his mind. Watson had learned, over many years of shared lodgings, to recognize the signs of a working night. The faint smell of pipe smoke drifting under his bedroom door in the small hours, the occasional soft footstep crossing the sitting room, and, in the morning, an ashtray that told its own story in layers. Watson came downstairs at 7:30 to find the fire already built up, and Holmes standing at the chemical corner in his shirt-sleeves, examining something in a small glass dish with the focused expression of a jeweller assessing a stone of uncertain provenance. On the table beside him were 3 small bottles, squat, dark glass, stoppered with cork, arranged in a line with a neatness that suggested they had been placed there deliberately and consulted repeatedly. "Good morning," Watson said. "Sit down," Holmes said, without looking up. "There is toast. Mrs. Hudson brought it 20 minutes ago, but I told her you were still sleeping," which was true at the time. Watson sat and found the toast and found it acceptable, and poured his tea, and waited with the patience of a man who had learned that Holmes at the chemical corner before 8 in the morning was best approached, as one approaches weather, acknowledged, respected, and not hurried. "Lavender oil," Holmes said, still examining the dish. 3 grades. This, he indicated the first bottle, is the common variety, sold at any chemist, any market stall, used in soap manufacture, in linen water, in the cheaper perfumes sold to shopgirls and housemaids. Lavandula, angustifolia, grown in quantity, distilled in bulk. It is pleasant enough, and has no pretension to be otherwise. He moved to the second bottle. This is the intermediate grade, French, almost certainly Provençal, harvested earlier in the season when the oil concentration is higher and the floral note is cleaner. More expensive. Used by the better perfumers, by dressmakers with aspirations, by the kind of household that has opinions about scent without being ostentatious about them. Middle class, in the best sense. He paused. He lifted the third bottle and held it toward the window light, where the grey morning filtered through and gave the dark glass a faint amber quality. "And this," he said, "is something else entirely." He brought it to the table and set it before Watson with the particular ceremony Holmes reserved for objects of significance. Not dramatic, just deliberate. Watson leaned forward. The bottle was slightly taller than the other 2, the glass finer, the stopper not cork but ground glass. There was no label. "Where did you get these?" Watson asked. "The first 2 I had in the house. I have used them in previous work involving scent identification. The third I sent a note to a colleague in the early hours. He is something of an authority on continental fragrance trade, and he owed me a professional courtesy from a matter we will not go into. Holmes sat down across from Watson with the abruptness of a man who has been standing for several hours and has finally acknowledged it. That third bottle is a grade of lavender oil that is not sold commercially in England at all. It is produced by 2 houses, possibly 3, in the south of France, specifically for use in high theatrical perfumery and in the preparation of stage atmospherics. It is used, Watson, by perfumers who supply the theatre. Watson looked at the bottle. The stage. The stage, Holmes confirmed. Specifically, the world of stage illusion, theatrical atmospheric design. The perfumers who work with lighting directors and set designers to produce environments that convince an audience they are somewhere they are not. A particular scent, precisely placed, precisely graded. It can reinforce an illusion as effectively as light. More effectively sometimes, because the audience does not think to be skeptical of what they smell. He reached for his tea, found it cold, and drank it anyway, with the indifference of a man for whom temperature was largely irrelevant when thinking was in progress. Madame Renar described the scent with considerable precision last night. She said it was not the lavender of sachets or soap. She said it had a quality of distance. She said it lingered like music. He set the cup down. She was describing this. Exactly this. Watson considered this for a moment. Outside, London was beginning its morning in the characteristic way of London mornings, gradually, reluctantly, with a great deal of noise from the direction of the Mews and the steady percussion of rain recommencing against the window. So whoever is doing this, Watson said slowly, has access to theatrical-grade lavender oil, which means we aren't looking for a person of general means with a taste for lavender. We are looking for someone connected, in some way, to the theatrical world, or to the perfumery trade that supplies it, or to someone who is. Holmes stood again. The sitting was, evidently, temporary, and moved to the mantel where his notes from the previous evening were arranged in a pattern that looked disorderly, and was almost certainly not. There are, in London, 4 perfume houses with established connections to the theatrical trade. I know of 2 personally. My colleague's note this morning confirmed the other 2. We will visit them today. All 4? The first 2 before lunch, the second 2 after, if required. He glanced at Watson with something that in another man might have been the beginnings of apology. It will involve a certain amount of walking. My knee, Watson said, is already aware. The first house was in a narrow street off the Strand. Not a shop exactly, more a place of business that happened to have a front room, the kind of establishment that conducted most of its affairs through correspondence and appointment, and regarded walk-in visitors with polite bewilderment. The sign above the door read, Marchand et Fils, Parfumeur, in the restrained gilt lettering of a firm that had been there long enough to feel no need to announce itself loudly. Inside, it smelled extraordinary. This was not surprising, but it was still, Watson found, something that required a moment of adjustment. The air in the front room was layered with fragrance in a way that was not overpowering, but was entirely total, as if scent here existed in the same relationship to atmosphere as water exists in the sea. There were shelves of dark glass bottles behind a long, pale counter. There were cards with samples pinned to them in ordered rows. There was a young man behind the counter with the careful, pleasant expression of someone trained to be both welcoming and discreet. Holmes presented himself as a researcher. He did this with complete ease, wearing the description the way he wore any chosen manner, without visible effort, compiling a professional survey of the supply chains for specialist theatrical fragrances in the London market. He had a notebook. He had a manner of engaged academic interest. He was, Watson thought, watching him, entirely convincing. Not because he was dishonest, but because the research was, in its way, genuine. Holmes researching a case and Holmes researching anything else were functionally the same person. The young man was cooperative and proud of his house's theatrical connections. They supplied, he mentioned with careful discretion, several of the larger West End productions, and had a long-standing relationship with 3 independent theatrical companies. Yes, they stocked the Provençal high-grade lavender. Yes, it was specialist. Yes, the client list for that particular product was quite small. Perhaps a dozen regular accounts in London, fewer abroad. The Paris supply, Holmes said, with the tone of someone making a note rather than asking a question. You would have counterparts there, houses with similar theatrical relationships. The young man did. He named 2, without needing to consult anything. It was clear he knew his field. Holmes thanked him, made his notes, and they withdrew, back into the grey morning, the rain now reduced to a fine, cold insistence that was less wet than it was simply present. The kind of rain London produced when it wanted to be tiresome without committing to anything dramatic. Paris, Watson said, as they walked. Paris, Holmes agreed. She came from Paris. The scent followed her from Paris. The logical origin point of the scent supply is Paris. He turned, up his collar against the rain with the decisive gesture of a man ticking a box. We are following the scent backward, to its source. The second house was larger, nearer to Covent Garden, and had the louder confidence of an establishment closer to the theatrical district it served. Here the staff were more forthcoming, theatrical people adjacent, Watson thought, to theatrical people, tending toward the expansive. The senior assistant, a woman of middle years with a remarkable composure, and the particular authority of someone who had been doing the same work excellently for a long time, received Holmes's research inquiry with intelligent interest, and added, without prompting, something that the first house had not. The Provençal high grade, she said. You will find that in London most of it comes through 2 importers. One of them is quite standard. We use him. Several others do. The other, she paused, with the slight pause of someone deciding how much professional commentary to offer, is more irregular. He supplies primarily to private clients, individuals, not houses. He does not advertise. His name? Holmes asked. She wrote it on a card and passed it across the counter with the serene efficiency of a woman who has just been helpful and knows it, and is not making a performance of it. Holmes took it, glanced at it, and put it in his pocket with a care that Watson recognized. Outside again, the rain had made up its mind slightly, and was now properly raining, the good honest kind that required an umbrella or a philosophical attitude, and Watson had one, and Holmes had the other, and they proceeded along the wet pavement toward the cab rank with the comfortable efficiency of long practice. The private importer, Watson said, is considerably more interesting than the houses, Holmes said. The houses sell to accounts. Accounts leave records. But a private importer supplying individual clients, He paused to flag a cab with the practiced gesture of a man who spent a significant portion of his professional life in London traffic. That is a much narrower channel, a much more deliberate one. The cab arrived. They got in, and the city moved past the windows in its grey, wet, morning fashion, the black umbrellas on the pavement, the horses patient in the rain, the shop fronts lit warmly against the dull sky, the smell of wet stone and coal smoke, and the river somewhere underneath everything, as it always was, as it always had been. "Holmes," Watson said, as they turned onto a broader street, and the cab found its pace. "The theatre connection. The Illusionist. You mentioned it last night." "I did." "Is that where we are going next?" Holmes looked out of the window. His profile, in the grey cab light, had the particular quality of settled thought, not distant, not absent, but quietly occupied with something that had not yet been said. "The perfume houses have given us a direction," he said. "The private importer will give us a name if we are fortunate. The name will give us a connection." He turned from the window. "And the connection, I suspect, will lead us somewhere with a great deal of velvet curtain and the smell of grease paint." He almost smiled. "We are going to the theatre, Watson, eventually, but we are going to be quite sure of our audience before we take our seats." The cab rolled on through the wet London morning, and Watson settled back against the seat, and the rain continued its patient work on the roof above them, and somewhere behind them, in the ordered shelves of a Covent Garden perfume house, a card with a private importer's name sat in Holmes's coat pocket, small and exact, and pointing, like all the best clues, towards something that was not yet visible, but was already, in some fundamental way, found. The name on the card was Beaumont. Not a house, not a firm, simply a name, written in the perfume house assistant's neat, unhurried hand, with a Clerkenwell address beneath it, and nothing further. No trade description, no hours of business. The kind of card that assumed the recipient already knew enough to find the rest, or would find it out, which amounted to the same thing. Holmes had said nothing further about it the previous evening. He had sat with his pipe and his notes and the 3 bottles of lavender oil arranged on the side table like a small, fragrant argument. And Watson had read, actually read this time, until the fire had burned to ash and the rain had finally exhausted itself against the window and the street outside had gone to the particular quiet of late London night, which is not silence, but is the nearest London comes to it. In the morning, Holmes was already dressed when Watson came down. This, in itself, was information. "Clerkenwell," Watson said, sitting down to his breakfast. "After," Holmes said. "There is something I want to do first." The something turned out to be the reading room of a particular private library near Bloomsbury, the kind of institution that existed in 1890s London in quiet abundance, maintained by subscription, staffed by people of formidable memory and minimal conversation, and containing within its ordered shelves a quantity of specialist knowledge that no single human mind could hold, but that Holmes had learned over years to navigate with the confidence of someone who had memorized not the library, but the librarian. The librarian, in this case, was a small, precise man named Howell, who greeted Holmes with the nod of long professional acquaintance, and led them without preamble to a section Watson would have described as theatrical history, though its actual organization was considerably more specific than that. Holmes spent 40 minutes with 3 volumes and a bound collection of continental theatre programs from the previous decade. Watson sat beside him, and was, he would freely admit, less productively occupied. He read the theatre programmes with the genuine interest of a man who enjoyed the theatre, rather than the analytical interest of a man extracting data from it, which meant he was entertained, but not illuminated. Holmes was neither entertained nor not entertained, being in a state beyond both, the state of pure extraction, reading with the focused efficiency of someone who knows exactly what they are looking for, and is simply waiting to find it. He found it in the 3rd volume. Watson knew this because Holmes went still in a way that was different from his reading stillness. A fractional pause, a quality of arrival. "There," Holmes said quietly, and turned the volume so Watson could see. It was a page of text with a small engraving at the top. The engraving showed a stage set, a parlour rendered in the theatrical shorthand of the period, a figure centre stage in formal dress with one hand raised. Beneath the engraving, a name, Le Grand Obscur, Edward Vane, illusionist and atmospheric conjurer, Paris, 1887 to 1891. Atmospheric conjurer, Watson read. His particular specialty, Holmes said, was the creation of what the programmes called environments of sensation, performances in which the audience did not merely see an illusion, but experienced it through multiple senses simultaneously. Light, sound, and, he tapped the page, scent. He was, by several accounts, extraordinarily effective. He worked the Paris circuit for 4 years. Holmes closed the volume with the careful deliberateness of a man returning a thing to its proper place, even before he has physically done so. He came to London in 1891. He has been here since. And Beaumont, the importer, supplied Vane's Paris productions. It is in the account ledgers referenced in the 2nd volume. I would not have found it without knowing to look. Holmes stood, returning the volumes to Howell, with a nod of thanks that contained within it, Watson suspected, several layers of professional gratitude compressed into a single gesture. Vane and Beaumont have a working relationship of at least 5 years, possibly longer. They went to Clerkenwell. The address was a narrow house on a street that had once been respectable, and was now in that intermediate state of London streets that are between one thing and another, not quite declined, not quite renewed, the buildings solid and the window boxes maintained, but the paint on the doors a few years past their best, and the area carrying the faint, not unpleasant smell of workshops and small commerce. Beaumont's house had a ground floor that served as a storage and dispatch room. Watson could see through the half-open door the shapes of crates and the organized disorder of a working importer, and above it, presumably, the rooms where the man himself lived and conducted his more personal business. Holmes knocked. They waited. The street around them went about its affairs with the busy indifference of a working London street in the late morning. A cart passing, 2 women with baskets in conversation outside a shop, a boy with a newspaper tucked under his arm, moving at the particular velocity of someone who is late, but has decided that hurrying would be undignified. The door opened. Beaumont was a man of perhaps 50, compact and careful in his movements, with the kind of face that had once been conventionally handsome and had since become more interesting. Lines around the eyes, a quality of weathering that suggested a life conducted largely at close quarters with other people's business, a watchfulness that was not unfriendly, but was entirely habitual. He wore a good coat, indoors, which Watson noted. Either he had been about to go out, or he was a man who kept his professional appearance maintained at all hours, which would fit with the nature of his trade. He looked at Holmes, then at Watson, with the assessment of a man accustomed to evaluating visitors quickly and accurately. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "not a question, a recognition." "You know me," Holmes said, with a quality of mild interest. "I know of you," Beaumont said, with the careful distinction of a man for whom that difference was meaningful. "You had better come in." The front room had the smell Watson would have expected. Rich, layered, the specific complexity of a space where many different concentrated fragrances had been present over a long period of time, and had accumulated into something that was not any one of them, but a composite of all. There were shelves, as are the perfume houses, but these shelves had a different quality, less retail, more archival. The bottles here were not for display. They were for use, or for reference, or for something that occupied the space between the two. Beaumont did not offer them chairs, but he did not keep standing in a way that felt hostile. It was more the manner of a man conducting a conversation he had been expecting, and had not decided the shape of yet. He kept his hands in his coat pockets. He looked at Holmes with a steadiness that Watson found, given the circumstances, rather impressive. "You are here about the lavender," Beaumont said. Holmes did not show surprise. "Tell me what you know." "I know that I supplied a quantity of the Provençal high grade to a private client 8 months ago. A specific preparation, not standard, custom blended with a fixative compound that extends the scent's duration and projection considerably." He paused. "It wasn't my first supply to this client, but it was the first time the nature of the commission gave me any reason for discomfort." "Why discomfort?" Beaumont looked at him for a moment. Then he crossed to one of the shelves and lifted a small bottle, different from the others, Watson noticed, sealed with wax rather than a stopper, and set it on the table between them. "Because the brief," Beaumont said quietly, "was not for a performance. It was for a private residence. Multiple locations. Paris first, then a London address. The compound was designed to be dispersed in enclosed spaces, small amounts, very precisely placed." He looked at the bottle. "In my trade, Mr. Holmes, there is a distinction between atmospheric work for the stage, where the audience consents to the experience, and the same technique applied without consent. I have worked in this trade for 20 years. I know the difference, and I do not." He paused, with the pause of a man choosing his words, not for politeness, but for accuracy. "I do not supply the second kind." "But you did," Holmes said. "Not an accusation, a fact, laid down carefully. I did not know, when I filled the commission, what it was for. The client presented it as a theatrical project, private theatrical, a production for a restricted audience, a kind of immersive entertainment that was fashionable for a time among a certain circle." He looked at Holmes steadily. "When I understood what it had actually been used for, I declined the subsequent commission. The client was—" He paused again. "Not pleased." "The client's name," Holmes said. A silence. Outside, the street continued its mourning. The cart had gone. The conversation outside the shop had concluded. The boy with the newspaper had long since disappeared around the corner. The room held its many-layered fragrance with the patience of a space that had been holding things for a long time. "I will tell you," Beaumont said, because I believe you already know part of it, and because I would rather the part I know be in your hands than elsewhere." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a card. A real visiting card, this one, cream stock, engraved. He placed it on the table beside the sealed bottle. Watson leaned forward and read, "Count Alexander Vaseri, late of the Imperial Diplomatic Service." Holmes looked at the card for a moment. Then he looked up at Beaumont. "And Vane?" he said. "Edward Vane." Something shifted in Beaumont's expression. Not surprise exactly, but a quality of resigned acknowledgment. The look of a man who had hoped one thread might not lead to another, and had found it did. "Vane introduced us," he said, "Vaseri and I, 3 years ago, at a private supper after one of Vane's London performances. They were," he chose the word with care, "close, or had been. By the time I met them, there was something between them that had the quality of a debt not settled, or a story not finished." He looked at Watson briefly, then back at Holmes. "Vane is a careful man. He keeps his own counsel, and he keeps his distance from trouble when he can see it coming. But he could not always see it coming with Vaseri. Very few people could." Holmes took the card and the sealed bottle, the latter with a question look at Beaumont, who nodded permission. And they left Clerkenwell, with the late morning thinning around them into a pale, watery noon. In the cab, Watson looked at the name on the card. Count Alexander Vasari. He turned it over. The reverse was blank. "Disgraced," Holmes said, answering the question Watson had not yet asked. "Recalled from his post. Vienna, I believe, though he served in Paris before that, under circumstances that were not made public, but that I recall reading a reference to in a diplomatic intelligence summary some years ago. Something involving an attachment, an inappropriate one, by the standards that govern such things." He looked out of the window. A man capable of patience and precision. A man who knows the theatrical world and its tools. A man who was in Paris when the disturbances began, and who has, I suspect, been in London rather longer than Madame Renar realizes. Watson was quiet for a moment. The city moved past, the noon streets, busier now, the pavement full, the smell of horses and bread and coal smoke in the damp air. "Holmes," he said, "the illusionist, Vane, he was protecting Vaseri." "He was protecting himself," Holmes said, "not unkindly. They are not the same thing, though they can look alike from a distance." He settled back. "We need to find Vane before Vaseri knows we are looking. Vane will talk, I think, if approached correctly. He is not a bad man. He is a man who made himself useful to someone he should not have trusted, and who has been trying, quietly, to find the edge of his own involvement ever since." Watson nodded slowly. The card was still in his hand, cream and precise, the engraved letters clean and permanent. Count Alexander Vaseri. A name that explained the lavender. A name that did not yet explain everything, not the mirror, not the Paris rooms, not the particular quality of being regarded that Celeste Renar had described with such careful honesty in the warm room at Baker Street. Those answers were still ahead, but they were closer. Edward Vane lived in Soho. This was, Watson reflected, exactly where an atmospheric conjurer ought to live. Soho, in the 1890s, being the part of London that had most thoroughly given up on respectability as a governing principle, and had replaced it with something more interesting, if less restful. It was a neighbourhood of small theatres and smaller restaurants, of foreign languages audible through open windows, of people who worked at night and slept in the afternoon and regarded the conventional London day with the mild curiosity of anthropologists observing a foreign custom. It smelled, depending on the street and the hour, of coffee and sawdust and frying onions, and, occasionally, of the particular compound of grease paint and size glue that clings to theatrical buildings the way coal smoke clings to everything else. Vane's building was on a street that ran between two busier ones, a quiet channel between currents, 4 stories of London brick with a tobacconist on the ground floor, and the upper windows dressed with the kind of curtains that suggested their occupants valued privacy, without being theatrical about it, which Watson found mildly ironic given the circumstances. Holmes knocked at the inner door beside the tobacconist's with 3 measured strokes, and then stood back and waited with his hands in his coat pockets and his gaze on the middle distance, the expression of a man who has already decided how the next hour will proceed, and is simply allowing events to catch up. The door was answered by Vane himself. Watson had, from the theatre programme engraving, formed a general impression, the formal dress, the raised hand, the stage presence compressed into a small, printed image. The man before him was both more and less than that impression. More, in that he was taller than the engraving suggested, and had the specific physical authority of a person long accustomed to commanding a room's attention. Less, in that he was wearing a plain indoor coat, and had clearly been interrupted in the middle of something. There was ink on his left hand, and his expression, when he opened the door, had the slight vacancy of a man returning from concentration. He looked at Holmes, then he looked at Watson, then he looked at Holmes again. "I wondered," he said, "how long it would take." "Longer than it should have," Holmes said pleasantly. "May we come in?" Vane's rooms were on the 2nd floor, 2 of them arranged as a combined working and living space with the comfortable disorder of a man who thought in objects. There were props everywhere, but organized props, not chaotic, but categorized in ways that were not immediately legible to Watson, and presumably were entirely legible to their owner. Silk cloths, wooden boxes with brass fittings, mirrors of various sizes, leaning against walls and propped on shelves, so that the room contained within it a dozen partial reflections that shifted as Watson moved, like a space trying to be several spaces simultaneously. And underneath everything, faint but present, lavender, the residue of it, Watson thought, rather than the thing itself, the ghost of a working scent, absorbed into the fabric of the room over time. Holmes noticed it too. Watson saw it in the brief, precise movement of his attention, a fractional orientation, like a compass needle settling. Vane cleared 2 chairs with the practised ease of a man accustomed to having visitors in a cluttered space, and they sat, and he sat opposite them on a low wooden stool that brought him slightly below their eye line, in a way Watson suspected was habitual and deliberate, a performer's instinct, making himself less threatening when he needed to be received rather than watched. "Beaumont sent word," Vane said, not defensively, simply establishing the facts. "I thought he might," Holmes said. "It does not change anything material. I would have found you in any case." Vane nodded, accepting this. He had, Watson thought, the manner of a man who had been carrying something heavy for some time and had arrived at the particular state beyond tiredness where the carrying becomes simply the condition of existence. He looked at his ink-stained hand briefly, Then at Holmes. "What do you want to know?" he said. "Tell me about Vaseri," Holmes said, "from the beginning, as you understand it. Not what you think I need. Everything." A pause. Vane looked toward one of the larger mirrors. Not at his own reflection, Watson thought, but through it, or past it, at something the mirror was standing in for. "Alexander Vaseri," Vane said, "is the most intelligent man I have ever known who has made the worst possible use of his intelligence." He said it without bitterness, which made it land with more weight than bitterness would have. "I met him in Paris in '88. He was attached to the Austrian diplomatic mission, a cultural liaison, which in practice meant he attended exhibitions and performances and wrote reports that nobody read, and in exchange was given the freedom of Parisian cultural life, which he used extensively and well." He paused. He had an extraordinary appreciation for the atmospheric, for the constructed experience. "He came to my performances first as an audience member, then as an acquaintance, then as something closer. He understood what I was doing more precisely than most of my colleagues did. He could articulate the mechanics of sensation in a way that was genuinely illuminating. And you became friends," Watson said. Vane looked at him. "We became," he considered the word, "collaborators for a time. He had ideas I found interesting. I had techniques he found useful. There was a period of perhaps 18 months where we worked together on the development of certain atmospheric effects that I still consider among my best work." He paused again. "And then I noticed what the ideas were becoming." "Celeste Renar?" Holmes said quietly. The name landed in the room with a weight that was disproportionate to its syllables. Vane was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of evasion, but the quiet of a man organizing something that had no comfortable organization. He had known her for some years, Vane said. They had moved in overlapping circles, the theatrical, the diplomatic, the literary. Paris has a way of making those circles intersect repeatedly until people know each other better than they have chosen to. He looked at his hands. He was attached to her, profoundly, in the way that certain people attach themselves to an idea of another person rather than to the person themselves, which is a kind of attachment that asks everything of its object and gives nothing that is actually wanted. He paused. She did not return it. She was kind about it, which is sometimes worse than unkindness in the long term, because kindness can be mistaken for a door left open. Watson thought of the word regarded, of Celeste Renar sitting in the chair at Baker Street, describing the feeling of being seen from a distance, and saying it was not quite fear. He thought of the half hour she had sat on the edge of her bed after the mirror message, thinking. "He asked for my help," Vane continued. "In the beginning he framed it differently. He said he wanted to create an experience for her, something beautiful and private, a series of impressions. He talked about it in the language we used for theatrical work. Environment, sensation, presence." He looked up at Holmes. "I helped him design the first iteration, the lavender dispersal, the mirror preparation. There is a simple compound, a mixture applied to glass that becomes visible in condensation, that I use for stage work. I showed him how to use it." He stopped. "I thought it was. I persuaded myself it was. A form of art, a private gesture, something she might find curious and then trace back to him, and that would open a conversation." "But she did not trace it," Holmes said. "She was frightened," Vane said, with a flatness that held within it Watson thought, the specific flatness of guilt. That has been examined many times and not resolved. Or unsettled, which to him was worse. He adjusted. He refined the approach. He told me it was working, which was not a word I would have chosen. He stood abruptly and moved to the window, not Holmes's window-standing habit of thought, but a more agitated movement, a man needing to do something with his body while his mind caught up. I told him I would not continue. He was not threatening, exactly. But he made clear that my involvement in the early stages made my separation from the later ones complicated. He implied complicity, Holmes said. He implied it with considerable elegance, Vane said from the window, which is consistent with his character. He is not crude. He is never crude. He turned. When she moved to London, which I did not know in advance, and which he told me only after the fact, I was... He paused, searching. I was very concerned. I did not know how to act on the concern. I wrote to Beaumont, who I knew had declined the subsequent commission. I tried to find out whether she had sought help. I had no means of reaching her directly without alerting Vaseri. Where is Vaseri now? Holmes said. Kensington, Vane said. A boarding house on... I have the street somewhere. He crossed to a desk and moved papers with the controlled urgency of a man who knows where something is, and is annoyed it is not immediately visible. He produced a folded note and handed it to Holmes. He is quiet. He has been quiet since she came to London. I believe he is watching still. But he has not escalated. He is... He searched for the word again. Waiting. For what? Watson asked. Vane looked at him with an expression that was complicated in the way that only simple things are complicated, things that are straightforward in their facts and opaque in their feeling. For her to understand, he said. That is what he told me the last time I saw him. He said he wanted her to understand something. I asked him what. He said... Vane paused, and something moved across his face that wasn't quite sorrow and not quite contempt, but occupied the territory between them. He said he wanted her to understand that she had taken something with her when she left Paris, without knowing it, and that it belonged to him. The room was quiet. One of the mirrors caught the pale afternoon light from the window and distributed it in a thin, cold stripe across the floor. Watson looked at it and thought about a woman standing in a doorway breathing lavender, the strangeness of the situation reasserting itself only after the first full breath. Holmes folded the note with the address and put it in his coat pocket beside the card with Vaseri's name. He stood. His expression had the quality of completed calculation, not satisfaction exactly, but the particular clarity of a mind that has assembled what it needed and knows what it will do with it. You will hear from me, he said to Vane. I would ask you not to contact Vaseri before then. I have not contacted him voluntarily in 4 months, Vane said. He said it quietly, looking at the floor. I want this to end, Mr. Holmes. However it ends, I want it to end. Holmes looked at him for a moment with an attention that was neither sympathetic nor unsympathetic, but was entirely human, the look of a man taking the full measure of another. I know, Holmes said, and left it there, which Watson thought was the right place to leave it. They walked for a time after leaving Vane's building. Holmes's preference, when thinking, was motion, and Watson had long since made peace with the fact that thinking walks were rarely short. The Soho streets received them with their customary indifference, the afternoon population of the neighborhood flowing around them, the theater people, the restaurant workers beginning their prep, the foreign community going about the untranslatable business of daily life in an adopted city. "He is not dangerous," Watson said after a time. "He meant Vaseri." "No," Holmes said. "He is not dangerous. He is something more difficult than dangerous." He walked for a moment in silence. "A dangerous man you can contain. A man who is consumed, genuinely, profoundly consumed by a feeling he has made into a project that requires a different kind of resolution." "What kind?" Watson asked. Holmes was quiet for half a street. "The honest kind," he said, "which is rarely comfortable and rarely simple, and which requires her to be present for it as much as him." He turned up the collar of his coat against the afternoon chill. "We will go to Kensington tomorrow. But first, I want to speak with Madame Renar again." Watson nodded. The afternoon was thinning toward evening, the light going from pale grey to the particular blue-grey that preceded gaslight, the city shifting registers the way it did every day, the working day giving way to the other kind, the streets changing their character without changing their geography. "Holmes," Watson said, "what he took, what Vaseri thinks she took from him without knowing." "Yes," Holmes said. "What was it?" Holmes walked for a moment. "The only audience he ever had," he said, "who understood what he was." Holmes spoke with Celeste Renar before they went to Kensington. She came to Baker Street at 10 o'clock, as arranged, punctual in the way of people for whom punctuality is a form of self-respect rather than mere courtesy. The morning was cleaner than the previous days had been. The fog had thinned overnight into something almost transparent, and the November light, while still pale, had a quality of genuine illumination rather than the usual grey approximation of it. Watson noticed that she looked more rested than at her first visit, and then revised this. She did not look more rested. She looked more decided. There is a quality of resolution that resembles rest from a distance and is something quite different up close. She sat in the same chair. She did not wear the veil. Holmes told her what they had found. He did this with a care that Watson observed closely, not because he was uncertain of Holmes's manner, but because the manner itself was instructive. Holmes stripped nothing from the account that was necessary, and added nothing that was not. He told her about the perfume houses, about Beaumont, about the theatrical grade lavender, and its specific provenance. He told her about Vane, with a fairness to Vane that Watson appreciated, making clear both the man's culpability and the limits of it. He told her about the compound applied to mirrors, the dispersal technique, the deliberate construction of what she had experienced as haunting. He told her the name. She received it without visible surprise, or rather, with the specific absence of surprise that is itself a kind of information. She sat with it for a moment, her hands still in her lap, her eyes on the middle distance that people look at when they aren't looking at anything external. "Vaseri," she said. "Not a question." "You knew him," Holmes said. "Also not a question." "In Paris." She was quiet for a moment. We were acquainted. For some years. He was a person whose company I found, at intervals, genuinely valuable. He had an extraordinary mind, a particular quality of attention that was—" She paused, and Watson thought of Vane saying the same thing in different words, the same man described from two different distances. That was, when it was directed well, quite remarkable. She looked at Holmes. And when it was not directed well? Consuming, Holmes said. She nodded once. I was kind to him, she said, and in her voice there was something that was not quite guilt and not quite defensiveness, but was the particular weight that kindness carries when it has been misread. I am aware that is not a sufficient explanation, but it is an honest one. It is, Holmes said. She looked at her hands. Then she looked up. What does he want? Holmes considered this, the genuine consideration of a man who has thought about a question from multiple angles and is deciding which answer is the most useful one to give. He wants, Holmes said carefully, to be understood, by you specifically. He has constructed an elaborate communication because he does not have, or does not believe he has, a simpler channel. He paused. He is not going to harm you. I am confident of that. What he has done has been frightening, and it has been wrong, and I do not minimize either of those things. But the intention behind it was not malice. It was, he chose the word with visible care, desperation, of a very particular and very misguided kind. She absorbed this. The fire spoke quietly. Outside, a carriage passed on Baker Street, the sound of it clean and distinct in the thinner morning air. Watson watched her face and thought about what it cost to sit in a chair and receive the information that the thing you had feared was not a ghost, but a person, which ought to be a relief, and was, but brought with it a different and more complicated weight. I would like to speak with him, she said. Holmes was still for a moment. Watson glanced at him. That, Holmes said slowly, requires some consideration. I have been considering it since you began speaking, she said, with a quiet precision that Watson found, in spite of everything, rather admirable. I am not asking to confront him. I am not asking for a scene. I am asking, she paused, I am asking to close the door properly, because I think that is what has not been done, and I think it is the only thing that will actually end this. Holmes looked at her for a long moment, with the full quality of his attention, the kind that saw past the surface of things without making a performance of the seeing. Very well, he said. We go to Kensington this afternoon. You will come with us, but you will let me speak first. The boarding-house on Pemberton Gardens was the kind of establishment that existed in several registers simultaneously, respectable enough for the street it was on, modest enough to suggest reduced circumstances, maintained with the particular pride of a landlady who had standards and intended to keep them regardless of what the neighbourhood was doing. The front step was freshly whitened. The curtains were clean. A small brass plate by the bell had no name on it, only a number, which Watson thought was consistent. Holmes rang. They waited, Watson, Holmes, and Celeste Renar, who stood between them with the composed stillness she had brought to everything, the stillness that Watson had stopped reading as coldness, and had come to understand as the particular posture of a person who has decided not to spend themselves in advance of what is coming. The landlady answered, a Mrs. Albright, stout and observant, who took in Holmes's card and their collective appearance with a rapid competence, and showed them, without excessive commentary, to a sitting-room on the first floor, where she said she would inform Mr. Vaseri that he had visitors. The sitting-room was small and clean and anonymous in the way of furnished rooms in boarding-houses, the furniture chosen for durability rather than character, a watercolour of indeterminate Scottish scenery above the fireplace, a clock on the mantel that kept accurate time with the mild self-satisfaction of a clock that has never been asked to do anything else. Watson stood by the window. Holmes stood by the door. Celeste sat in the chair nearest the fire, with her coat still on, and her hands folded and her eyes on the door. They did not wait long. Count Alexander Vaseri was, Watson saw immediately, not what he had been constructing in his imagination over the past 2 days. He had built, from the accumulated evidence, a figure of some menace, not violent, as Holmes had said, but consuming, driven, the kind of man whose intensity operated at a frequency that disrupted the ordinary atmosphere of rooms. The man who entered was instead ordinary, not in a disappointing way, but in the way that is more unsettling than the dramatic alternative, because ordinariness in a person who has done extraordinary things forces a reckoning with what ordinary contains. He was perhaps 50. He had the bearing of a man who had once been important in rooms that measured importance carefully, and who had since learned to carry that bearing in private rather than public. His face was unremarkable, except for the eyes, which were grey and very still, and which went, the moment he entered, directly to Celeste Renar and stayed there, not with aggression, not with hunger, but with something that was almost worse, simple, total recognition. The look of a man seeing the thing he's been looking at in its absence, finding it unchanged, and being entirely unsurprised that he is still affected. He stopped when he saw her. Then he looked at Holmes. "Mr. Holmes," he said. His English was excellent, precise, slightly formal, with the controlled quality of a language long practiced rather than naturally acquired. "Count Vaseri," Holmes said. "Sit down, please." He sat. Not because he was told to. Watson had the impression that being told to do things was not generally how this man operated, but because he had assessed the situation and decided that sitting was the correct response to it. He sat across from Celeste with the small table between them, and he folded his hands on his knees, and he waited with a patience that had clearly been constructed over a very long time from materials that weren't naturally patient. Holmes spoke. He did so with a directness that was also, Watson noted, a form of kindness, the kindness of not prolonging what needed to be said. He laid out what he knew, briefly. The lavender, the compound, the mirrors. Beaumont, Vane, the London supply. He spoke without accusation in his voice. He was simply describing a sequence of events in their correct order, which was damning enough without any addition of tone. Vaseri listened to all of it without interruption. His eyes moved, once, from Holmes to Watson, a brief assessment, a cataloguing, and then returned to Holmes. And when Holmes had finished, he was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to become deliberate. "You have been thorough," he said, and then to Celeste, directly. "I am sorry." She looked at him. "For which part?" she said. It was not unkind. It was a genuine question, asked with the precision of a woman who understood that apologies had specific contents, and that the contents mattered. He received it as it was intended. "For the fear," he said. "That was not—" He paused. "That was not what I intended to cause. I intended—" He stopped again, looking at his hands, and Watson saw something move across his face. That was neither performance nor suppression, but simply the difficulty of a man trying to say an honest thing about something that didn't have comfortable, honest language. "I intended to make you feel that I was still present. that Paris had not, that I had not. He stopped. That you had not been forgotten, Celeste said quietly. A silence. The clock on the mantel marked it with small, neutral strokes. No, Vaseri said, and then, after a moment, yes, partly. He looked at her with the grey, still eyes. You left Paris, and you took the version of myself that existed when I was known to you. I did not know how to, he chose the word carefully, how to remain without it. Watson looked at the floor. He had the strong feeling of witnessing something that was both entirely necessary and deeply private, and he kept his eyes down and his breathing quiet, and was grateful that Holmes was doing the same. Celeste was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I knew you were unhappy when I left. I told myself it would pass. That was, she paused, that was not generous of me. I think I knew it was more than that, and I chose not to examine it closely, because examining it closely would have required me to do something I did not want to do. She looked at him steadily. I am sorry for that part. You do not owe me, he began. I know I do not owe it, she said. I am offering it. There is a difference. Another silence, this one different in quality. Lighter, Watson thought. Settled, rather than held. Holmes spoke then, and his voice had a quietness that Watson associated with his most careful moments, the moments when he was not solving, but simply being present to a human situation with the full respect it deserved. What happens now, Holmes said, is that this ends, not because it is required to by law, though it is, but because you both understand, I think, that it has run the length of what it was. There is nothing further, that letters on mirrors can say that a conversation cannot say more honestly. He looked at Vaseri. You are an intelligent man. You have used your intelligence in the service of something that has diminished you. That is a waste, and I think you know it. Vaseri looked at him. Then he looked at Celeste, and he nodded, once, with the slow definiteness of a man making a decision he had been approaching for a long time and had simply needed the right moment to arrive at. Yes, he said, I know it. They left Pemberton Gardens in the mid-afternoon, the three of them, and stood for a moment on the whitened front step, while Mrs. Albright closed the door quietly behind them. The street was still and pale under the November sky. A few leaves moved along the gutter. Somewhere, not far, a church bell marked the hour with the unhurried confidence of something that had been marking hours for a very long time and intended to continue. Celeste Renar stood between them and looked at the quiet street and breathed the cold air with the specific quality of breath that follows the conclusion of something. Not relief, exactly, but release. The slight expansion of a person returning to their natural dimensions after a long compression. Thank you, she said to Holmes, then to Watson. Both of you. Watson said that it had been no trouble, which was not entirely accurate and was not meant to be accurate. It was the appropriate thing to say, and accuracy was not what the moment required. Holmes said nothing, which was what the moment required from him. They found a cab. The city moved past the windows in the late afternoon way, the light going golden at the edges despite itself, the streets beginning their evening shift. The gas lamps not yet lit, but their presence anticipated in the slight premature darkening of the air around them. Watson looked out of the window and thought about the word consent that Beaumont had used, and about remainder, which was what Vaseri had been living in, and about offering, which was what Celeste had made in that small room, unprompted and unasked. He thought about the lavender, how it had been designed to haunt, and had instead, ultimately, led somewhere honest. Holmes sat beside him and said nothing all the way back to Baker Street. Winter came to Baker Street the way it always did. Not dramatically, not with the sharp announcement of frost or the theatrical gesture of the first snow, but gradually, by degrees, the way most true things arrive. The days shortened, the fires burned longer. The fog, which had been a presence throughout the Renar case, became a permanent condition rather than an occasional one, settling over the city each evening with the comfortable authority of something that has decided to stay. Watson found himself returning to his notes. This was not unusual in itself. He returned to his notes regularly, adding marginal observations, correcting small errors of sequence, occasionally crossing out a phrase and replacing it with one that more honestly reflected what had actually occurred, rather than what had seemed to be occurring at the time. But the Renar notes he returned to more than most, and with a different quality of attention. Less editorial, more ruminative, perhaps. The way one returns to a piece of music, not to analyze it, but simply to hear it again. He'd made a promise to Celeste Renar before the case was fully concluded. She had not asked dramatically. She had asked in the way she did most things, with a quiet directness that made the request feel less like an imposition and more like a reasonable arrangement between sensible people. She had asked that the case not be published, not because she was ashamed. She had been at some pains to make clear that she was not ashamed, but because Vaseri was still alive and still findable, and because Vane was still working, and the particulars of his professional methods, if made public, would harm a career that had already sustained sufficient damage, and because she had, in that small room in Kensington, offered something private, and she wished it to remain so. Watson had said yes without deliberating, which told him something about where his inclinations already lay. Holmes had made no objection. Holmes, in Watson's experience, had a complex relationship with publication. He valued the record, but not the audience, and had on more than one occasion expressed the view that Watson's readership, while gratifyingly large, was not the constituency whose opinion he found professionally meaningful. For the Renar case, he had simply said, "As you think best, Watson," with the ease of a man delegating a question that genuinely didn't concern him to the person it genuinely did concern, which was, Watson thought, its own form of respect. So, the notes went into the casebook, and the casebook went on to the shelf, and the winter deepened around 221B in the way it always did, with fires and pipe smoke and the smell of Mrs. Hudson's cooking rising through the floors in the early evening, with Holmes moving through his cycles of activity and stillness, with the city outside the windows conducting its enormous, indifferent business, and with Watson sitting in his chair on quiet evenings and thinking at intervals about lavender. He thought about what the case had been, at its heart, not a ghost story, though it had arrived dressed as one, not a crime, precisely, though it had contained one. It had been, he decided, a story about the distance between feeling something and understanding what to do with it, which was, he supposed, one of the oldest stories there was, and one of the least soluble. Vaseri had felt something large, and had made it into something wrong. Celeste had understood something clearly, and had been too gentle with the understanding, which was its own form of error. Vane had known something was wrong, and had not known how to act on the knowing, which was perhaps the most common error of all. And Holmes had navigated between all of them with the particular quality that Watson had spent years watching and years trying to name, and had finally decided could only be called care. Not sentiment, not softness. The precise, intelligent, unsentimental care of a man who took people seriously as the complicated things they actually were, rather than as the simpler things it would have been more convenient for them to be. He had not exposed Vaseri publicly. He had not brought the case to the police. He had brought the involved parties into the same room, and had said the true things that needed saying, and had left the rest to them, which was, Watson thought, the right proportion. The law would have given Celeste protection, but not peace. Holmes had tried for peace, which was harder and less certain, and, in this instance, more valuable. Whether it held, Watson did not know. He had seen Celeste once more, in December, at a small gathering hosted by a mutual acquaintance who had no idea that the two of them shared any particular history. She had been well. She had been present, which was a different and better thing than merely fine. She had spoken to him briefly, in a corner of the room, about the translation work, which was going well. She had not mentioned Baker Street or Kensington. At the end of the conversation, she had pressed his hand once and said, "Thank you for your company, Doctor," in exactly the words she had used on the night of her first visit, which he did not think was an accident. Of Vaseri he had heard nothing. Holmes had, he suspected, heard something. Holmes had sources Watson was not privy to, and did not ask to be. But Holmes had said nothing, which Watson took to mean that what had been heard was neither alarming nor interesting, which was, all things considered, the ideal outcome. Of Vane, Watson knew the most. Vane had written to Holmes in the new year a brief and careful letter thanking him for his handling of the matter, and informing him that he had severed his remaining connection with Vaseri entirely, and had returned to legitimate theatrical work, with, as he put it, renewed appreciation for the consent of my audience. Holmes had read the letter once and placed it in a file and said nothing, but Watson had seen him, later that evening, in the posture of a man who had received something that satisfied him, which was its own sufficient comment. The fire in the sitting-room burned with the settled patience of a winter fire, not the ambitious, high-built fire of the Renar evenings, but the quieter, steadier burn of ordinary winter nights, doing its job without performance. Watson sat in his chair with his notes on his knee, and the casebook open beside him, and the pen in his hand that he was not presently using. Outside, Baker Street was fog and gaslight, and the muffled percussion of the city going about its evening. Carriages, footsteps, the distant bell of something marking the hour, with its usual philosophical indifference to whether anyone was listening. The smell of the rooms was the smell it always was, coal smoke and old paper, and the faint chemical traces of Holmes's various investigations, and underneath all of it, warm and permanent, the smell of somewhere lived in, somewhere that was, despite its peculiarities, or because of them, unmistakably home. Holmes was at his desk, writing. Not case notes. His posture when writing case notes was different, more angular, the pen moving in bursts. This was correspondence, perhaps, or one of the long, dense theoretical papers he produced at intervals and published in journals that Watson gamely subscribed to and occasionally understood. He wrote with the steady, absorbed concentration of a man at work, he found genuinely satisfying. And the scratch of his pen across the paper was a sound Watson had come to associate with evenings that were quiet in the best sense, not empty, but complete. Mrs. Hudson brought tea at 8:30. She set it on the table between the chairs with the efficient tenderness that was her characteristic mode. Not fussy, not demonstrative, but thoroughly present. She looked at the fire, found it acceptable, and withdrew with the particular quality of departure that left a room feeling more inhabited rather than less. Watson poured the tea. He set a cup at Holmes's elbow, where it would go cold. He sat back down with his own cup and his notes and the quiet room around him, and the fog outside, and the fire beside him, and the scratch of Holmes's pen, and thought about a woman in a lavender veil standing on a pavement in November, deciding. There was courage in that, he thought, in the deciding, not the grand deciding, not the deciding of stories where the choice is clear and the stakes are announced, but the quiet kind, the deciding to walk up the stairs, the deciding to lift the veil, the deciding to say I am not a fanciful woman and mean it, and be heard. He closed the casebook. He did not lock it. He simply closed it and set it aside and picked up his tea and sat with the warmth of it in his hands, while the fire settled and the fog pressed gently at the window, and Baker Street went about its unknowing evening outside, full of its own quiet mysteries, its own small decisions, its own lavender trails leading back to something true. Some cases, Watson thought, are not for the public record. They are for the quieter shelf, the one you return to on evenings like this, not to solve again, but simply to remember that it was handled with care, that it was handled as the best things are, with as much kindness as the truth would allow. That was enough. That was, in the end, exactly enough.